Imagine you are standing on a ship, not a modern vessel, no steel hull, no engine vibration beneath your feet. This is wood and rope and canvas, the kind of ship held together by tar and prayer and the knowledge of men who have been reading the sea their whole lives. The year is somewhere around 140 BCE. The Mediterranean stretches in every direction so blue it almost looks painted, so still in this early morning hour that the horizon barely moves. You can smell salt and pitch and something older, the particular smell of open ocean that has no name in any language but which every sailor who has ever lived has inhaled and understood. You are on the island of Delos, or rather, you are arriving at Delos. And Delos in this era is not simply an island. It is the beating financial heart of the ancient Mediterranean world. It is the place where Rome and Greece and Egypt and every ambitious merchant power between them come to do the thing that makes empires possible. The thing that is considered in this moment in history as natural as weather. They come here to buy and sell human beings. On a good day, 10,000 people pass through these docks. 10,000. Captives from Pontus, from Thrace, from Numidia, children separated from their parents in the time it takes to count coins. Families who will never speak their own language again, who will spend the rest of their lives in service to people who do not know their names. The auction blocks here process more human cargo than anywhere else in the ancient world. Rome's appetite for enslaved people is insatiable, and Delos feeds it. Every day. Every tide. But there is something else on this island right now. Something that the merchants and the auctioneers and the Roman magistrates are not yet aware of, something that is moving quietly through the quarters where the enslaved are kept, something that travels mouth to ear in whispered languages the Romans don't speak. A plan, an organization, a network of people who have already decided, quietly, patiently, furiously, that this will not continue. And at the center of that network is a woman whose name history has almost entirely erased. Almost. If you found your way here, to this channel, to this particular darkness and this particular hour, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. A lot of people who listen to Hidden Past Revealed are doing exactly what you might be doing right now. Lying down, letting the day go. Using this voice and this story to carry them gently out of the noise and into something quieter. That's exactly what this channel is for. If you haven't subscribed yet, I want to gently ask you to do that. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the next time you need this, something new will be waiting for you. It genuinely helps more than you know. And if you feel like dropping a comment, tell me where you are right now, what time it is there, what your night looks like. I read those more than you'd think, and they matter every single time. Now, let's go find her. When most people think about the history of enslaved people resisting their enslavers, one name dominates the entire story. Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator, the man who led the Third Servile War beginning in 73 BCE. Whose rebellion swelled to somewhere between 70 and 120,000 people, whose army defeated Roman forces again and again across 2 years of open fighting, whose legend was eventually resurrected by every revolutionary movement from the Haitian Revolution to the labor movements of the 20th century, whose face you've probably seen on a movie poster. Spartacus is the story we tell, and there's nothing wrong with that story. It's real. It happened, it was extraordinary, but here is what almost nobody tells you. Spartacus was not the beginning, he wasn't even close to the beginning. The Roman world had been convulsed by massive organized revolts by enslaved people for nearly a century before Spartacus ever picked up a weapon. And the largest of those earlier revolts, the one that shook the entire island of Sicily and forced Rome to deploy consular armies, was not started by a man. It was started by a woman. Her name, in the Greek sources that recorded it, was Darmophila. Some scholars render it differently. The ancient texts are inconsistent in the way that ancient texts always are when they're recording someone they consider unimportant. She was Syrian. She was enslaved in Sicily on a large estate belonging to a man named Demophilus, a Roman landowner of the kind that ancient historians describe with barely concealed horror, a man whose cruelty was evidently extreme even by the standards of an extremely cruel era. Most people who know anything about the First Sicilian Slave War, and that's already a small group, believe it was led by a man named Eunice, a Syrian slave who performed fire-breathing tricks and claimed to have prophetic dreams. And Eunice is indeed in the sources. He did play a role. He was eventually named king of the rebellion. But here is what the evidence actually shows. The revolt did not begin with Eunice. It did not begin with any act of dramatic male heroism. It began with the women, with Demophilus' cruelty becoming so unbearable that the enslaved people on her husband's estate organized and made a decision, and with the women and men around her deciding, collectively, that something had to change, and then making it change. The role of women in ancient slave revolts has been systematically compressed, minimized, and in many cases erased by the ancient sources, who were themselves almost universally wealthy, male, and Roman. When Diodorus Siculus, one of our main sources for this period, describes what happened in Sicily, he mentions the women, he mentions Demophila, the enslaver, he mentions women among the rebels, and then he moves on, back to the men. Back to the fighting, back to the narrative that ancient historians found easier to write. But when you read carefully, when you follow the thread, the picture that emerges is far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more true than the one we've been given. To understand what happened in Sicily in 140 BCE, you need to understand what Sicily was. Not the Sicily of today, those sun-drenched hill towns, the smell of lemon trees and sea wind, the slow afternoons and the cathedral spires. That Sicily exists, and it's beautiful. But the Sicily of the 2nd century BCE was something else entirely. It was an agricultural machine. It was the breadbasket of Rome, a vast island of wheat fields and olive groves and livestock estates. And it ran almost entirely on the labor of enslaved people who had been brought there from every corner of the Mediterranean world and from well beyond it. The numbers are difficult to verify, but the ancient sources suggest that by the time the revolt began, there were somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 enslaved people on the island. This on an island whose total population might have been around 1 million. Think about that for a second. You are talking about a society where a third or more of all human beings are legally the property of someone else, where the structures of daily life, the food, the roads, the buildings, the running of estates, depend entirely on people who have no legal rights, no protection, no recourse. And the conditions had been getting worse. There's a pattern that repeats across history whenever a system of exploitation has been running long enough to become normalized, and that pattern is escalation. The first generation of enslavers is at least somewhat aware that they are doing something that requires justification. They construct philosophies, religious frameworks, legal architecture, but the second generation inherits the system already constructed. The third generation grows up inside it. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman slaveholders in Sicily were operating within a system so entrenched, so matter-of-fact, so woven into every aspect of economic life, that many of them seem to have entirely stopped thinking about it as a human situation at all. Demophilus was one of these men. Diodorus describes him with a kind of outraged disbelief. A man of enormous wealth, obscene personal luxury, and absolute indifference to the suffering of the people whose labor had created that wealth. He and his wife Demophila were, by ancient accounts, notoriously harsh even among harsh masters. Enslaved workers on their estate were kept in chains even while performing outdoor agricultural labor. They were refused adequate food. They were beaten when they approached with requests for clothing, for tools that weren't broken, for anything that might make their work slightly more bearable. They were dismissed or punished for the asking. Demophila, according to Diodorus, participated in this cruelty actively. He describes her as torturing enslaved women for minor infractions. He describes children being killed. He describes a household in which the violence had stopped being functional, stopped being the kind of cold terror that a slaveholder might argue was necessary for control, and had become something more personal, more sadistic, more about the pleasure of power itself. And yet, in the way that human beings are extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily dangerous when pushed beyond a certain point, the people on that estate were not simply enduring, they were planning. You have to imagine the texture of those conversations, held in whispers, in the dark, in the brief spaces between labor, in the moments when the overseers weren't watching, in whatever language connected people from Syria and Greece and Numidia and Gaul, who had been thrown together by the machinery of Roman conquest. There would have been fear in those conversations, bone-deep fear, because failure meant crucifixion, meant torture, meant death in forms that would have been very specifically designed to discourage anyone else from trying. There would also have been something else, something that doesn't get recorded in ancient sources but which you can feel in the structure of what happened next. There would have been anger, and organization, and trust. The enslaved workers on Damophilus's estate approached Eunice, the fire-breathing, dream-interpreting Syrian whose reputation for contact with the divine gave him a kind of authority that transcended the usual social hierarchies of a slave estate. They asked him what the gods said, whether they should do this, whether the time was right, and Eunice, who had been watching and waiting in his own way, told them what they needed to hear. But here is the thing that the sources almost don't say, and which matters enormously. The decision had already been made before they asked him. The women and men who came to Eunice were not asking for permission. They were asking for blessing. They already knew what they were going to do. They had already identified the people they trusted, already begun to coordinate with enslaved workers on neighboring estates, already understood with the particular tactical intelligence of people who have spent years studying a system from the inside. What the weak points were, where the weapons were kept, which guards could be surprised, which roads led where. The rebellion began on a night in 135 BCE on the estate of Damophilus, and it spread within days to the entire surrounding region, and then further, and then to the whole of Sicily. Within a year, a force of somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 people. The ancient sources vary wildly, but the scale was enormous by any measure, had taken control of large parts of the island, defeated Roman military expeditions, established an organized political entity with Eunice as its acknowledged king, and held out against Rome for nearly 3 years. It was the largest revolt by enslaved people the ancient world had yet seen. And Damophila, the enslaved Syrian woman whose name gets mentioned once, twice, fleetingly as the rebellion's organizing energy before the narrative moves on to swords and battles, was there at the beginning of all of it. Here's what nobody tells you about the way ancient revolts actually began. They did not begin with a single heroic figure rising up in a moment of individual fury. They did not begin with one person deciding they had had enough. That's the story we tell, because it fits the shapes of the stories we already know. The lone rebel, the spark, the face on the poster. But the historical evidence, when you read it carefully, points to something much more interesting. They began with women. This is not a romantic claim. It is not an ienentiological one. It is simply what the evidence suggests when you follow the threads that ancient historians considered unimportant enough to mention without dwelling on. The social structures of enslaved communities in the ancient world, the way information moved, the way trust was built and maintained, the way collective action was organized, were largely structured around women, for reasons that are actually quite logical once you understand the social geography of a large Roman estate. Women who worked in households, in kitchens, in the private quarters of the owner's family, tending to children, doing laundry, weaving, were mobile. They moved between spaces. They spoke to people in the house and people outside it. They heard things, they carried information, and they occupied a position that was in some ways more dangerous than the men working the fields, more exposed to personal violence from the slaveholder's family, but also, paradoxically, more connected, more networked, more aware of everything that was happening. Demophila appears in the sources not as a passive figure, but as an active one. What fragments of the ancient accounts suggest, and historians like Yvonne Petrina and the earlier work of Keith Hopkins on Sicilian slavery have teased this out carefully, is that the organizing for the revolt was done in the women's quarters of the estate, in the domestic spaces that Roman overseers paid less attention to in the hours before dawn when the day's work hadn't yet started. And here is where something extraordinary happened, something that the ancient sources record but don't quite seem to know what to do with. When the revolt began and Demophilus and Demophila were captured, the assembled rebels held a kind of impromptu assembly to decide their fate. Demophilus was killed. Demophila, the woman who had participated in the torture of enslaved people, who had been part of the machinery of cruelty that had driven people to this point, was also killed, but not before a woman, an enslaved woman whose name was Megalis, gave testimony about what Demophila had done to her. Megalis was given her freedom by the assembly. Think about that for a second. In the middle of a violent revolt, in the chaos of armed uprising, the people involved paused to conduct something that looked remarkably like a trial. They weighed testimony. They made a distinction between the guilty and the innocent. They freed a woman who had spoken. This is not the behavior of people in a mindless rage. This is the behavior of people who have been thinking carefully about justice, who have been thinking about it, probably, for a long time. The revolt moved. It spread to other estates, other parts of Sicily. Eunice was declared king, taking the Syrian name Antiochus, styling himself after the great Seleucid kings, creating a political theatre that was simultaneously strategic and genuine, a way of telling Rome that this was not a riot but a state, not chaos but a challenge. His queen, and this detail exists in the sources, was a Syrian woman. The rebellion established its capital at Enna in the mountainous interior of the island. At its height, it controlled a substantial portion of the Sicilian countryside. Roman consular armies were sent. The first one was defeated. The second struggled. It took until 132 BCE, 3 years, before Rome finally crushed the revolt through force of numbers and the particular Roman talent for grinding patient military pressure. Eunice was captured and died in prison. The leaders who were caught were executed. The survivors were re-enslaved, and the ancient historians wrote it up, filed it away, and moved on to the next thing, mentioning the women in passing, recording them as background texture, as detail. But the women were not detail. The women were the architecture. Step back for a moment. Step all the way back. There is a thing about recorded history that we don't talk about enough, which is this. The shape of the record reflects the interests of the people who created it, not their lies necessarily. Most ancient historians were not consciously trying to deceive, but they were trying to tell stories that made sense to them, stories that fit the frameworks they had inherited, the values they had been taught, the things they had been trained to consider important. And in the ancient Mediterranean world, the people doing the writing were, with very few exceptions, male, wealthy, free, and Roman or Greek. This means that the history they wrote is full of gaps, not intentional gaps, just the ordinary gaps that come from people not noticing what they don't think matters. Women are mentioned when they do something so dramatic it can't be ignored, then passed over. Enslaved people are recorded as actors when they're rebelling, because rebellion is hard to ignore, and ignored otherwise. The daily life of the people who built these civilizations, the inner worlds of the people who fed and clothed and raised the children of the powerful, has almost entirely disappeared. What we have instead are fragments, traces, the accidental preservation of detail, And when you learn to read those fragments, when you learn to notice what the ancient historians are almost saying, what they mention and then don't follow, a different world appears. Consider the Second Sicilian Slave War, which began in 104 BCE, just a generation after the first, again in Sicily, again organized, again involving networks that had clearly been building for some time before the visible outbreak. This revolt was led by a man named Salvius, who again took a royal name, styled himself Tryphon, established a court, minted coins, operated a genuine state, and again, running through the account, barely visible but present, women who moved information, women who built the trust networks that made collective action possible across estates where people spoke different languages, came from different cultures, had different histories of captivity. Ancient revolts required something that doesn't get talked about in military history, which is social infrastructure. You can't coordinate an uprising across dozens of estates without the ability to communicate. You can't maintain secrecy across hundreds of people without systems of trust. You can't translate plans between Syrians and Gauls and Greeks and Numidians without people who move between different social worlds and speak multiple languages and have built relationships across those worlds. Who were those people in the social structure of a Roman slave estate? The women who worked in houses, the women who served at tables and heard conversations, the women who crossed between the domestic spaces and the field spaces, who knew everyone, who were trusted precisely because the slaveholders had decided they were unimportant. Here's what this means, and it's something worth sitting with as you lie in the dark. Every major organized revolt by enslaved people in Roman Sicily was built, in part, on a foundation of social organizing that happened in spaces the powerful weren't watching, and those spaces were largely the spaces women occupied. The kitchen, the weaving room, the water source, the children's quarters, the places where enslaved women did the work that was considered beneath the dignity of historical record. The revolts that we remember as the dramatic military events of Eunice and Salvius and eventually Spartacus, those were the visible tips of something enormous and largely invisible, networks of trust and communication and shared purpose that had been built, day by day and year by year, by people whose names we mostly don't have. Demophilus' name survived because someone thought to write it down once. How many others didn't? And here is the part that reaches across 2,000 years and touches something in you. Because you live in a world that still does this, not in the same way, not with the same horror, but the mechanism of deciding that certain kinds of work, certain kinds of organizing, certain kinds of social infrastructure are less important, less worthy of record, less real. That mechanism is still running. Think about the informal networks that hold communities together. The people who check on the elderly neighbor, the people who organize the neighborhood response to a flood or a fire, the people who know which family needs food this week and who can provide it, the people who mediate the conflict between two groups before it becomes visible conflict, the people who translate between cultures, between institutions and individuals, between the powerful and the powerless. Who does that work? In most communities, in most historical periods, in most cultures, the answer is the same, and the answer is also the answer to why that work is invisible. It is not invisible because it is unimportant. It is invisible because the people doing it have been systematically excluded from the category of the important. And then when those people do something that is impossible to ignore, when they organize an uprising, when they lead a movement, when they change the course of history, the account written afterward tends to focus on the aspects that fit the existing story. The leader, the battle, the king, the general, not the woman in the kitchen who built the network that made it all possible. Demophila understood something that the slaveholders on those Sicilian estates never understood, despite spending years in close proximity to the people they were exploiting. She understood, and the other women in those spaces understood, that power is not only visible, that the most durable kind of power lives in trust. in relationship, in the quiet certainty that the person next to you will not betray you, that the information you share at the water source will go only where you intend it to go. The Roman slaveholders were too busy counting their grain to notice what was being built in the spaces between. That's not just a historical observation, that's a human one. We are always, all of us, missing what is being built in the spaces we're not watching, always too focused on the visible and the dramatic to notice the quiet, patient, consequential work happening in the places we've decided don't matter. The history of the world is full of people who were told they were background detail. Some of them, in their fury and their brilliance, made themselves impossible to ignore. Most of them didn't get the chance. But they were building things anyway. They were always building things. It's quieter now. The day is further away than it was when you started listening. Your body knows this, can feel it in the weight of your limbs, the way your breath has slowed without you asking it to. You are somewhere between the world and the place the world goes when you stop attending to it. Think of Sicily. The sea there at night is very dark. The stars are different from the ones you might know, or maybe the same, depending on where you are and whether your sky is clear. The mountains of the interior are very old. The grain fields that covered the island in the 2nd century BCE are gone now, replaced by orchards and vineyards and the patient Mediterranean marquee. But the island is still there, the same stone, the same sea, 2,000 years ago, on a night like this one. Dark, still, the stars doing what they always do. A woman in a building on that island was awake when she should have been sleeping, speaking to someone in a low voice, saying something that mattered, something that couldn't be said in daylight when the overseers were watching, something that was part of a longer conversation that had been going on for months, maybe years, in exactly these moments. The dark ones, the quiet ones, the spaces between. Her name was Damophila, or it was Megalis, or it was another name entirely, a name the ancient sources didn't record because the person who wrote it down didn't think it mattered. Her name is probably lost forever, but she was there, in the dark, building something, and here you are, in your own dark, your own quiet, your own between space. The continuity is real. The humans who lay down at the end of their days 2,000 years ago and looked at the dark ceiling of wherever they slept and thought about the people they loved, the things they feared, the world they wanted. They were made of the same material as you, the same neurons firing the same signals, the same heart doing what hearts do, the same ancient animal need for rest, for safety, for the moment when you can put down whatever you've been carrying. Let it down now. The night is long, and it belongs to you. No more carrying, just this. The breath, the dark, the ancient permission to be still. Thank you for spending this time with Hidden Past Revealed. Genuinely, these late nights we share matter to me more than I know how to say. If this helped you drift, or if you found yourself surprised by something you'd never heard before, I'd love a like. It's a small thing that makes a real difference. And if you want to leave a comment, where are you right now? What time is it there? What does your night look like? I read them. I think about the geography of all these people lying in the dark together, listening to the same story. It's one of the stranger, more beautiful things I know. If you haven't subscribed to Hidden Past Revealed, now is a good time. It means there'll always be something waiting for you on the nights when your mind won't quiet down on its own. And if you ever want to support this work more directly, there's a channel membership that helps keep these scripts going. No pressure at all. Just know it's there and it matters. One last thing before you go. Somewhere tonight, the same stars that Damophilus saw are still up there. Older now, slightly changed, but doing what they always do. And somewhere, people are lying down in the dark the way people always have, trusting that morning will come, trusting that it's safe to let go for a while. You are part of that line. You always have been. Sleep well. You've earned it.